Okay, so hello, welcome to the Scientia Writing Internship Cohort 3. Today, our guest is Miss Rachel Jones. Miss Rachel Jones is a veteran in science journalism and science writing, and she's a media consultant for more than 30 years. And today, we would like to welcome her. Currently, she is affiliated with uh, National, National Press Foundation USA. She's a director of journalism. She has been mentoring and writing and doing the consultancy work within different fields such as healthcare policy, climate change, reproductive health, sustainability, and a lot of stuff. And we welcome you. And please, you can tell us about yourself. And over to you, Ms. Rachel. Thank you. Thank you for joining, Sancha.
Well, thank you so much. And I have to take this opportunity to thank Sadiqa Khan for the invitation, and also Foos for working with me to help me get prepared for this. I just want to say that I have been posting on my social media about how exciting this is for me because I have done trainings in Europe, on the African continent, in the U.S. So this is my first formal opportunity to speak with interns, journalists, etc., on the Asian continent, and so it is truly a privilege, and I'm really excited to be here. Let me just give you a little bit of background about me. I was born in the Midwest of Illinois, or Midwest of the U.S. in the state of Illinois. I am come from a very large family, 10 children, and we were born in poverty. I was born during the civil rights movement of the U.S. In the year 1961. I know you can't believe I'm that old, but I am that old. And so I just say that to say that my lived experience has totally fueled my approach to journalism and the reasons that I report on the topics that I report on. Because, again, born in poverty to an African American mother, 10 children, access to resources, access to healthcare, access to even food was something that was a very real issue for me early in my life. So now, all these years later, and I look back on all the experiences that I've had, I realized that my early lived experience influenced so much of my journalism career in ways that I could not have even understood really early on. So today's discussion is about science and storytelling. And I believe that this is such an important conversation for you to be having and for me to be exploring with you, because when you think about it, science underpins just about every aspect of life that we experience on this globe. Uh, the science of health and medicine, the science involved with agriculture, the science involved in technology and innovation, the science involved in education. So there is just so much that often we forget is fueled by science. So that when you blend that with the issue of storytelling, it helps you to understand that for too long we have treated data and research as this sort of alien thing or this formal thing. I want journalists to understand and embrace the use of science in storytelling and how they can make it more accessible to more people. So I'm ready to begin. I guess, do you go full screen or do we just go like this?
Uh, are we not full screen
Well,
currently?
not on my end, but if you're on your end, that's fine. All right, great. So as you can see, this first slide, you see the logo there. I'm actually so very proud of that logo because when I received a grant from the Kenyan Alliance of Health or from the Wellcome Trust rather in the UK to start something called the Kenyan Alliance of Health and Science Reporters, what I wanted to communicate in creating a logo was the intersection of science and journalism. So you can see the microphone there, the red microphone. You can see the notepad in the H, and you can see the microscope, or yeah, in the R. All of these things communicated the intersection of writing and science. Next slide, please.
Okay.
So my journey, my true journey towards science and storytelling began in 1991 at a publication called the Chicago Reporter. It was an investigative newsletter that focused on race and poverty. And so in Chicago, as in many major Midwest or American cities, you have a very stark divide between the haves and the have-nots. And so in the south side of Chicago in particular, is primarily African American, primarily lower income people. And so this publication was created to help explore the issues that people in these communities face. So in 1991, I had several years experience as a daily news reporter, and then I got this grant to do investigative reporting. And I wrote an investigative story about the Illinois Medicaid hospice program for low-income families. And as a part of that reporting, I interviewed a 15-year-old boy who was dying of brain cancer. And I'll never forget sitting at his bedside, speaking with him. It was traumatic. It was, for me, of course, and certainly for him and his family. But it affected me in ways that haunted me for a very long time. But it also inspired my reporting. So because of my story, the program was saved. It was about to be cut from the Illinois state budget that year. And because I was able to dig into the numbers and the research, and specifically to show that the money spent on allowing people to be in the hospice program versus the money that would be spent for them dying in a hospital connected to machines and taking all sorts of medications and having doctors poke and probe and whatever. When I ran those numbers and presented them to readers, saying that this is a much more economical use of our funding, again, it saved the program. And so that had a very powerful impact on my career. Next slide. So in 2008, I moved to Kenya, and I was there to train journalists to report on health issues. And it was through a grant from the International Center for Journalists and from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. They sent people like me into countries around Africa to serve as mentors and trainers for journalists who either were already attempting to cover health issues, but who were also wanting to learn more. And so the partnership was also with the Kenya Medical Research Institute that is based in Nairobi. So I organized trainings and that were focused on giving the journalists the opportunity to interact with scientists and researchers. Next slide. So when I arrived, after reviewing media and talking with people and speaking with scientists and researchers, what I concluded was that health coverage either wound up on the back page or inside of the magazine or inside of publications. It was relegated off to something that was not important, or it focused on death and suffering. So a story about 340 children died at birth at a hospital in Nairobi got published. Or on the front page, a story would be about how the United States would cut health aid to Kenya. So that certainly made a big impression. And editors and newsrooms could understand why that needed to be covered. And one story that I saw very early about cancer patients pleading for specialists in clinics. Shortly after I got there, I learned that in a country of 40 million people, there was only one radiotherapy machine, and that was in Nairobi. And so, again, coming from the US, even though probably more than half of Americans can't afford specialized treatment of any type, it's certainly available in most places. And so that was a statistic that shocked me. Next slide. So my central mission was to equip journalists to ask the tough questions and explore policy decisions that resulted in needless suffering and death for millions of people. Use this slide because this was the first project that I organized in September of 2008. I asked about 7 journalists in Nairobi and at other bureaus of Nation Media Group. This is the Daily Nation newspaper, to go to a local healthcare facility and just report on what they saw. Don't go to the hospital administrator. Don't go to the local politicians and ask them why it's like this. I just said, go and do a sort of day in the life story about what you. This is the first time I was told, and I believe it's probably true, that a health story like this wound up on the front page of Daily Nation newspaper, because it wasn't just numbers and accusations and policy, whatever. It was a series of stories about what it's like to sit in a waiting room in Western Kenya, or what it's like to attempt to get your child treatment for malaria in Kilifi on the coast of Kenya. It had a powerful impact. Literally a few weeks later, in the Kenyan parliament, members of parliament discussed that piece, and it didn't. I'm not so naive as to think that it changed anything immediately, or that it had any significant impact on people's lives. But all these years later, I'm very proud of the fact that I was involved in elevating the conversation about healthcare access in Kenya, even if for a brief moment. Next slide. So again, my strategy for Kenya was to create opportunities for journalists to interact with researchers and healthcare providers. And I did that through a series of interactive briefings and facility tours that helped journalists to demystify the practice of healthcare in Kenya. So many of them were so used to going to prearranged press conferences. They never certainly got to tour a facility, or they never got to ask questions, etc. So I came in and created these opportunities. As you can see on the poster on the left-hand side of the screen, that was 1 week training based on something called the Kilifi Health Data Surveillance System. And that is, again, what I'm sure all of you know or are aware of, how data surveillance systems, how people gathering data is at the very core of health policy in most countries. You have to know how much disease is occurring. You have to know how much, where the need is. And so I was able to have them spend a week in Kilifi talking to the people who collected the data. In the lower right-hand column or section of this slide, you'll see a woman standing at the back. There are 2 young men in front, and she's at the back. She's not a journalist. She was not a journalist. She was a malaria scientist. She was a researcher. She had worked at the Kenya Medical Research Institute Wellcome Trust program for almost a decade. But she came to me at Daily Nation newspaper, where I was based, and said, I'm tired of writing studies and producing research that sits on a shelf and nobody ever gets to see it, or it doesn't make a difference. I would like to learn how to communicate health to the public. Next slide, please. So Tabitha Mwangi, her name, she participated in the program because of the reasons I said. When I had the opportunity to produce a series of stories about child health for the East African News Weekly, which is another of Nation Media Group's publications, Tabitha led that research. She led that report. This was ahead of, I think it was World, and so we decided to put together a special edition on health in East Africa, and she was the lead reporter. But on the right-hand side of this slide, you will see something that occurred or appeared in the Daily Nation newspaper's living section, which is like the family magazine and the family stories in most publications. And this was her story about how the time her child developed pneumonia and almost died. And it is such an interesting story how that came about, because as she was doing this series of normal reporting about the numbers and the data and how pneumonia affects people in Kenya, she casually mentioned to me that, oh, by the way, my son almost died of pneumonia. And I thought, tell me more. I wanted her to talk about it. And she was able to talk about it freely and told me all of the dramatic details. But when I said, you have to write about that, she resisted. She was absolutely against doing it because I'm a researcher, I'm a scientist. People don't need to know my feelings, or my story isn't important, only the data and the numbers. And I kept pushing, and rewriting and turning it from more formal writing into, how did you feel when that happened? What did he look like? How long was he in the hospital? Was it stressful? Asking her those kinds of questions and getting her to write a piece about that experience wound up on the front page of publication. Next slide. So today, Tabitha is a program director at University of Cambridge in the UK, but also in February of 2024, her very first book was published. It's called 12 Remarkable African Life Scientists. And she simply interviewed 12 prominent scientists across the continent and asked them to tell about their life stories and how they were influenced to become scientists. And I'll go ahead and brag. She gave me a acknowledgement in the acknowledgement of the book as somebody who really helped her get beyond the formality of science and to understand how stories matter. Next slide. So another young woman was named Joy Wanja when I first met her in 2008. She was a recent student from the University of Nairobi, but her mother was also a maternity nurse. Unfortunately, I couldn't find any pictures to show you her at that time, but she is a brilliant woman. She spoke 5 languages. She spoke Japanese, Kiswahili, English, and I think some Spanish. But because of culture and tradition, she was very, very shy, very passive, would not look people in the eyes, was very deferential. And I think that me being of African descent, moving through the newsroom and talking to editors, waiting for permission to speak, probably had an impact on her and helped her to grow into her own as a journalist. But as I say, her mother was a maternity nurse, and her very core issue that she was wanted to report about was reproductive health. And so the story on the left is about again, the Kenya, let me see if I can see it. I can't, but it was about the Kenya data around women and maternal health and research, etc. And so instead of just doing a story about what the numbers say, she focused on rural women in Kenya, is like 3/4 of the women in Kenya live in rural areas. And so how their numbers, she pulled that one set of numbers out of the data and did a story about the threats to them. And the woman featured in that story had just given birth to twins. And so a complicated birth in a rural area is almost a death sentence. But she also went to northern Kenya to a region called Turkana, Isiolo. And as you can see, the headline is "It's babies until the wombs are empty." So culture and tradition call for women to just continue to give birth, no matter what their health status is, no matter whether the children are dying of starvation or illness or whatever. And so she wanted to tell stories again, not to point fingers, to blame anyone per se, but just to communicate the reality of reproductive health in Kenya. Next slide. Today, Joy is an award-winning journalist. She's probably literally every award available in the African continent, but she's also a PhD candidate in public health communication at Washington State University in the US. And she wants to go back to Kenya eventually to help communicate and developing policies that yield better access to healthcare and healthcare information for the Kenyan public. Next slide. This next woman's name is Julie, or it was in 2008 when I met her. And that picture on the left is the night after. She was at a reception that was announcing the fact that she and one of her colleagues had won a grant from the Wellcome Trust in the UK to start something called the Kenya Science Cafe. I'm not sure if that exists in Pakistan, but it is a program that brings scientists and researchers to a local cafe, and the public is welcome, and they talk about issues, and the public can ask questions, and the researchers and scientists can get a sense for what people's concerns are when it comes to science and research. And so when I first met her and she told me about this, I had never heard of the Science Cafe, and I was fascinated. And I helped her, with it. I said, anything that I can do to support you and get the journalists involved, I will do. Next slide. So today, I don't know if that picture is coming across, but she is a science communications consultant who has organized trainings for the Wellcome Trust, the Gates Foundation, the African Academy of Sciences, and the Science for Africa Foundation. I've embedded a video clip in this slide that I hope will play. But this was her at a science communication panel during the Gates Foundation Grand Challenges Africa meeting. This was a meeting of all African scientists and researchers across the continent. And this occurred back in October of 2019. Can you play that, Foos? Can you hear it? Is it not coming across?
I think the audio is too low. Let me just retry.
Okay. I might be able to play it on this end. I've connected my Bluetooth speaker. So hold on.
Sure, amazing.
Okay. Bear with me here. I'm going to try to see if I can.
Sure, sure, sure. Amazing. Let's try.
Technology is not my strength. My strength is words.
Well, we will share down the slides. I think you can convey somehow. Would it be
Oh, I'm
possible?
in the wrong. Hold on 1 second. I'm in the wrong
Sure.
email.
Take your time.
So anyway, whether I can get it or not. Oh, here we go. But the point is, for her, as I try to track this down, Juliet was a young researcher, like and scientist and whatever, like some of the people on this call, perhaps, who had a very strong passion for public health, um, wanted to ensure that the people that she sees around her country who are suffering. All right, here we go. Let's see if you can hear this. Can you hear it? No.
I think no.
Well, we will just move on then. I had embedded some clips in this presentation, hoping that you could hear voices, but
Uh,
apparently
Ms. Rachel, I think we will share this presentation with
that's fine.
our participants. Okay.
So, but in that clip, she talks about her work with these organizations and how she herself leads trainings on communication and how to help scientists communicate information to journalists. Next slide, please. She also has launched a thing called Connecting the Dots podcast, and it focuses on, excuse me, African scientists. Fascinating. First of all, she has a very beautiful lilting voice, but also she talks to women like this woman, Charity Waiua, who is a scientist who focuses on, I believe, reproductive health. I will forward a link to her Spotify podcast so that you can share that as well. But it's really just a conversation with her and a researcher. Her very first one, I believe, was a conversation with the former president of Mauritius, Amina Gurib Thaqib, I believe is her name. And she's an environmental scientist, first woman president of Mauritius, and just a conversation. How did you start in science? What were your influences? Why did you feel that your position as president you could elevate these issues? So, very fascinating interview, and she's done a series of these, and I encourage all of you to listen to them. Next slide. So, after nearly a decade of doing this kind of work in East Africa, eventually it became my turn to report on health and science and communicate an important issue. So in 2019, National Geographic asked me to report on a growing body of research around maternal mortality worldwide. One data point out of all of the research that had been developed was that in the US, Black women are 4 times more likely to die in childbirth than white women. Yeah, so numbers don't lie. I mean, you can argue about whether these women are all poor and or that whether they have poor health care practices, they do drugs, whatever it is, whatever stereotype you want to believe about why this would happen, it's happening. And so a publication called ProPublica began a series of investigative reportings about this. And as you can see in the slide, they collected nearly 5,000 stories of maternal harm. And, obviously a good percentage of those were not just harm, they were death. But again, the most astounding aspect of the research was that in the US, and here's the most important aspect, I think, of that finding, is that it doesn't matter whether a Black woman is rich or poor or whatever. Rich Black women die 4 times more likely than white women. So that created a huge amount of conversation, media coverage, etc. And so then National Geographic, out of all the publications in the world, um, decided they wanted to weigh in on it. And I have to quickly say that the only reason I got involved is that a woman named Deborah Adams Simmons was asked to serve as a consultant to National Geographic in 2018. She says that the woman who was editor at that time, she was actually the very first woman editor of National Geographic, Susan Goldberg. But when she began to plan for this global health issue, she was sitting at a table with 15 other National Geographic's reporters, and they were all white and mostly male. And Susan said, "This is not acceptable. We need to have someone of color come in and have this conversation." Deborah and I had worked at the Detroit Free Press 20 years prior to this happening. And so she knew that I had lived in East Africa, and so she was able to bring me on board. But the whole conversation around who is the gatekeeper of news, who makes the decision about what is a story. If all the people at the table making the decisions look the same, all come from the same socioeconomic background, and in this case primarily are all men, how are you going to do a story about reproductive health? It does not make sense. So she asked me to come on board. Next slide. So I talked to many people in the US about this issue, but the highlight of my reporting was when I traveled to Somaliland in East Africa. And I interviewed a woman named Edna Adan Ismail. She is a globally recognized champion for reproductive health, reproductive and child health. I also worked with a woman named Lindsay Adario. She is a legendary award-winning photographer. And spending a week with Lindsay, watching why she takes photos, how the angles that she uses, how she organizes them, how she either is actively organizing and setting a scene, or if she is just letting it happen and waiting for the right moment to capture an image. I feel as though I had a master class just watching. So it was a very important reporting trip for me. Next slide. But spending a week with Madame Edna taught me more about the power of telling stories in 1 week. Taught me more than I've ever learned. And I've been in this game almost 40 years as a professional journalist. Again, look her up, learn and read about Madame Edna. She tells the story of how she underwent female genital mutilation as a child. Her father was a highly educated, prominent man in society. He left to go on a business trip, and her mother and grandmothers secretly sneaked and had this done to her. He was furious and enraged, and from that moment on, he vowed that he was going to do everything he could to ensure that she had an education, that she had all the benefits and opportunities that traditional culture would deny her. And so she became a midwife. She traveled the world. Until maybe about 5 years ago, she was the foreign minister of Somaliland. She was a health minister at one point. She is just one of the most phenomenal women I've ever met, if not the most phenomenal woman. So again, that was an inspiration for me to do this story. Next slide. And this is another one that you can listen to when you get the slide deck. But just her energy in this photo, in this interview, she was 82 years old. So she is now, let's see, 2018, 6 years. So she's about 88, 89 years old right now, and still active, still traveling. She's literally my life role model at this point. And I have many, but she's probably at the top of the list. Next slide. So all of those stories told by Madame Edna and the scenes that I've witnessed with my own eyes yielded my very first published story for National Geographic, which was in their January 2019 Global Health issue. And the story was entitled, main story was entitled, Why Giving Birth in the US is Surprisingly Deadly. Because again, the United States has the highest rate of maternal mortality of any developed nation. So you can see the irony of being the quote richest country, the country with the best research, the country with the most resources is the country where more women die in pregnancy than any other developed nation. Um, when you compare it by averages and whatever, U.S. maternal rate is on par with Uganda. I think is the country that they compared it to. So it's appalling. It's unacceptable. It's horrible. And even though coverage around this issue has sort of lowered, simmered down, if you will, it's not nearly as high as it was 6 years ago. There are many advocates and researchers in the U.S. who continue to talk about this issue and tell stories. Next slide. So how did I turn the corner from training journalists internationally to working for the National Press Foundation? It is a 50-year-old organization that creates opportunities for journalists to learn deeply about issues, to have briefings, to connect with researchers and academicians and thought leaders and prominent journalists. Next slide. Well, it was quite a challenge for me because in today's information environment, um, it's challenging to help journalists decide what's a story, um, decide what medium is the best way to convey it. You know, journalists today have to be almost multimedia. They have to be thinking not just of words. When I started in 1986, my first formal job, all I considered was words on a screen. I have to, and then, you know, eventually in a newspaper. And so that was my sort of narrow vision. And I shouldn't say narrow because nothing else existed, but that's all I had to consider. I wanted to get a story that wound up in the St. Petersburg Times newspaper, and if I was lucky, it'd be on the front page, and that's how the public got informed. Well, today, reporters aren't the only way that people get information. Social media is hugely important, as you well know, and information can be acquired and shared instantaneously, push of a button. And you can stay informed in ways that have nothing to do with being a journalist per se. Next slide. One thing that I think is I use as sort of a handy tool is, particularly when it comes to science and storytelling, is to remember that facts and data are not messages. So those journalists who, and there are many journalists who are very expert and skilled in presenting a news study and explaining all of the nuances of it, and that is very important to do, and it's a very important skill to have. But when it comes to telling stories with science, remember that they're not messages. It's information, it's important information, but what message are you trying to convey when you're writing about a topic? So for example, again, in the reproductive health area, more than 350,000 women die in pregnancy and childbirth annually. Well, what's the message? Too many women die, particularly in 2024, when again, we in theory have access to information, the technology, whatever it takes to prevent these high numbers. And again, depending upon what your beliefs are and your belief system, more than 200 million women lack access to contraceptives. Well, the message is perhaps, if you believe in this, as a global society, we don't allow women to choose when and how often to have children. So again, that's a very touchy subject. It's a very personal issue. It can change depending upon what your cultural and religious beliefs are. But whatever message that you are trying to convey in exploring a topic, remember that. Next slide. So journalists who want to transform data and research into memorable stories should always seek the core narrative. Well, what makes a good narrative? Find a story whose subject, rather, whose story embodies the central theme of your story. So in other words, if you're writing about uh, obesity, find someone who may be struggling with it, someone who may have tried every diet or every health regimen or whatever, and still is obese, or someone who, for some medical reason can't lose weight. And then you sort of use them as the framework for telling your story. Make sure that you, as simplistic as possible. You don't want to water down research too much, because you can come across as not really being authoritative. Determine what is the end point. What is the message that you want the reader to leave with, or the viewer to walk away with? And here's another important one. Most important is what you leave out. In reporting on science and research, it can be very difficult to know what to leave out. You can feel like this data point is important, or this researcher, what he or she said was important. But for space reasons and for many other reasons, sometimes what you leave out is more important. Clarity, again, clarity is crucial in this process. Think about what you're wanting to convey, and make sure that you state it clearly. And then repetition. Drive home those core messages by finding expert sources. Will strengthen them in different ways. If you feel that the position that you're taking is an important one, find several people who will help the reader or the viewer understand why it's important. Next slide. So at the National Press Foundation, one of the programs that I organize is called Covering Rare Diseases. And I've done it now for 2 years. I started at NPF in 2021, December of 21. The first one that I organized was in October of 2022. And so this class last year in November of 2023 involved 25 international journalists from South America, North America, Asia, and Africa, and Europe. And so it was a series of 5 days of virtual trainings. And next slide, please. So the virtual trainings involved presentations from people like Anna Greca, who is a leading international researcher around kidney diseases and other sort of blood disorders, at the Broad Institute, which is an institute connected with the MIT and with Harvard. And her presentation was highly rated. She talked about breaking the chains of inherited rare disease. So again, this is an exploration, a deep dive into the genetics of rare disease and how researchers sort of put that puzzle together. And then the other speaker was a man named Dr. Eric Seed. He's with the National Institutes of Health, and he's leading an initiative to ensure that more patients and families have access to rare disease information. Next slide. But I think equity and access to rare disease treatment and information were the most important themes during the training. And literally the #1 most highly rated session featured a woman named Victoria Gray. She is a Black American woman who endured agonizing episodes of sickle cell disease throughout her entire life, until she was the first patient in the world to undergo CRISPR gene therapy. Look that up. And in fact, you can go to nationalpress.org and take a look at all of these sessions during the training. Just type in Covering Rare Diseases, and you'll get access to the videos from 2023, 2022, and 2021. I was not involved in that one, but you can learn about the sessions of, or how the National Press Foundation organizes trainings around these topics. Next slide. So the third volume of National Press Foundation trainings around world rare disease, excuse me, the stories that were produced will be released soon. So I'm very excited about that. It's been, the 2023 fellows work has been compiled in a soon to be released volume called Living with a Rare Disease Worldwide. And it's published by Foundation Ipsen, which is a foundation based in Paris, but they funded our trainings. Next slide. So, for example, here's some samples of the work that was produced. A woman named Rupsha Chakraborty of India. She produced a dozen stories related to rare disease in India. And this one is around the family of the very first recognized or known patient with Pompe disease in India. Next slide. A woman named Manuela Calari of Italy wrote about the mental health toll on patients living with rare diseases and their families. Next slide. In the US, a woman named Megan Holohan wrote about a group of American mothers of children with rare disease who supported a Ukrainian family that needed help getting treatment for their child's rare disease. Next slide. A man in Nigeria, Taiwo Adebulu, wrote about technological advances in gene therapy and how they offer little hope for patients who live with rare diseases in low and middle income countries around the world. Next slide. And then last but certainly not, Sadiqa Khan of Pakistan wrote about the blood disease beta thalassemia and its impact in your country. So just incredible opportunities for journalists to, again, do a deep dive into these topics, to hear from leading researchers around the world, to deepen their understanding of issues, whatever the issue might be, and then go back to their newsrooms and produce feature stories or stories, informational stories that illuminate these issues in ways that are different than what we expect. You know, when you hear a story about rare disease, you're expecting something fairly formal and you know, numbers and data. Well, we want journalists to see the humanity or the human aspect of these topics and to produce information that matters. So, next slide. This is another one that you'll need to listen to later, but I'll tell you the story behind it. This is a woman named Damaris Matoke. She, again, a senior scientist with the Kenya Medical Research Institute in Kenya around malaria. And I met her in Nairobi when I was doing a training with the Aspen Institute in the US. And it was a training for researchers, academicians, and community advocates to teach them about storytelling, about how to communicate their research in ways that actually resonate and actually make a difference. And so, again, she was very resistant to talking about her research in any way other than very formal. You know, she's used to going to conferences and standing at a podium and doing a PowerPoint and, you know, being very precise, etc. But through a week of trainings, scientists like Damaris learned how to be much more conversational, how to be approachable, how to talk about it. And this is something that I use when I work with any researchers or journalists or whatever. Learn how to communicate these issues as if you were sitting across the table from your mother, from your neighbor, from a friend, and you know they don't care about how many degrees you have or how smart you are. They need to understand why this issue matters in their life. And so that concludes, next slide, my remarks. Go to the next slide. So again, this has been an extraordinary opportunity for me because, as I say, I've been talking about these issues around the world, and so now another corner of the world I have made a contribution to. So I really hope that you will, if you want, stay in touch with me. And I'm more than happy to support the work of Scientia and what it is that you are trying to do to support young journalists, researchers, etc. So thank you very much for this opportunity.
Pause your mute.
Well, the entire journey had been truly amazing. The stories you brought up, the things, the sequence, and more importantly, how you highlighted the things that how people can learn, grow, and make a difference. And more importantly, I enjoyed the presentation from the context of global South, how people we as a global South, how we can make a difference, how can we push boundaries, how can we do a very very small changes that could amplify, and how you introduce a lot of people. This is really amazing for our participants, and for me as well. I learned how we grow as writers, as scientists, and more importantly, as a person. Thank you for your, and also mentioning your personal touch. So this was everything was amazing, uh, and I hope all the participants have enjoyed. And I think now you guys can ask questions. So, okay, first my question would be here. I would get my chance first. So, Miss Rachel, you mentioned a story about a woman giving birth from Black African community, and they have the highest percentage of surviving. So, what were the two or three key factors? What do you think?
So the most fascinating aspect of this conversation was a topic called weathering, and I will ask you all to do your research and look into that topic. But before I explain what that is, poverty is probably the number one issue or the reason uh, women who live, and this is women of all backgrounds, so white women, Hispanic women, Asian, whatever. If you live in poverty and the resources are low, if you live in a community where there's no maternity hospital or there are no clinics, etc., or if you do live in a community but you can't, you don't have insurance, you don't have money to get to the clinic, to get a taxi, and there's no buses and no whatever. So poverty is number one. Um, so when you, for women of color, when you add poverty to issues of racism, one of the most fascinating issues that I found in this reporting was I spoke to many women of color who are doctors and lawyers and PhDs and wealthy women who would talk about going into their medical facility and having the person behind the counter say, well, what drugs do you take? Or who's your baby daddy? Or just being very disrespectful and just drawing conclusions based on race and dismissing them. Or a third issue is the issue of pain. So when a woman presents in any medical facility, and this is worldwide, too often they can be accused of being hysterical or not really understanding, or their pain can be dismissed. They can be thought of as, whatever. But for women of color, a Black woman specifically, you can be accused of being a liar, or you are perceived as having a higher threshold of pain. And I will give you a very powerful example from my reporting. I was at a hospital in Washington, D.C., in a labor and delivery room. There were two women in beds. One was a white woman, younger white woman. Another one was a sort of a middle-aged Black woman. And the medical team came in. And they walked first over to the black woman's bed, and I'm sitting there now. They know I'm with National Geographic. They know I'm reporting on this topic. They sort of poked at her stomach and pulled her cover back, and she's moaning. Right, she's delivering. She's giving birth to a child, and whispered a few things to each other, and then turned and went to the bed of the young woman, white woman. They all crowded around her. They all whispered and cooed and how are you doing? And let's examine how many centimeters are you expanded and all of these things, and comforted her, and you'll be all right. You'll be right. We'll be back. And then they walked out of the room. And I was stunned. Now I have to say, I have never given birth. So I'm one of these American women that Vice President candidate J.D. Vance talks about, childless women who don't care about America. But I stood there and watched that and was horrified that in the same settings, unequal treatment. And based on, what else could I conclude? But that, they probably felt that she could handle it better. That she was carrying on. She was overreacting. So back to the concept I was telling you about. It's a body of research around how systemic racism literally affects people physically. It historic, body of having this in your genetic, it almost encodes on your genes, in that if you are a descendant of slavery and your ancestors were terrorized and mistreated and whatever, and then you come into 2024 and still getting mistreated still. So that was something that I truly, for a lot of reasons, can understand. But all of those things came together to lead to this high incidence of mortality and morbidity for women of color when it comes to childbirth. So I hope that answers your question.
Yes. There is another question from Gopika Krishnan. Could you get into the message, or I can read it? How would you like? Okay. The question is, for a person's scientist by training, what would you say is the most important point to move into storytelling?
So it is, again, I think, as I said earlier, and this is very important, and you should all walk away from this thinking about this. You're all doing very important work, and you're all delving into important topics that affect people in your country. But again, how would you tell the person at the bus stop about what you're doing and why it matters? You must always think of the human impact of the work that you do. And just start with maybe attempting to write down a single paragraph about how your research matters in Pakistan's progress, development, future, the country's future. And just practice it with yourself. Always think about, and this is what I do during training, what I did during the training in Nairobi for Aspen Institute. So many brilliant men and women who do amazing, fascinating research. But as I would tell them, that it doesn't make a difference to me. Again, I don't care that you are a PhD. Tell me about how 10 years from now, the work that you're doing will matter in South Africa.
Amazing.
And it really forces people to stop being so formal and I am Dr. So-and-so. It really helps them to state it in a way that is accessible for the general public, that people can understand.
Well, that answer was quite amazing. You are right about making a difference and amplifying the effect, and how after 10 years, 20 years, 5 years, how you are changing down the things. Communication is truly one of very important abilities a human can have. regardless of being their career or dream. And well, any other question? We are very much near to our time. Any other question you guys can have? Okay, yes, Hira, please ask the question.
Uh, Hello. Thank
Hi,
you, thank you, Ms. Rachel, for this
you're welcome.
amazing session. I wanted to ask a question that as you deal with healthcare journalism, so how do you navigate ethical concerns and overcome limitations in your storytelling?
Your question broke up a bit. Fools, can you restate it maybe?
Yeah. It was that as you deal with the healthcare journalism, how do you navigate ethical concerns and
Oh,
overcome limitations in storytelling?
so yeah, that's a very important question, and something that journalists must keep in mind, but also scientists. Ethical concerns can include, obviously, revealing patients' identity or talking about sensitive topics to communities that may have different belief systems, etc. So ethical considerations are very important. But again, um, for me, I'll just share the central strategy I had coming into Kenya, because journalists in Kenya at that time were literally under the threat of being arrested, of being terrorized, of being whatever. And so I knew I could not go in and try to teach them how to go up to the minister of health and say, what happened to all the money or whatever. It could literally be the difference between life and death for them. So it all came back to storytelling. It all came back to, don't tell me something, show me something. And so when it comes to a scientist and it's a possible ethical situation, etc., really break it down to the fundamentals. Um, what is the impact on people's lives? For journalists, you might be dealing with some ethical situations. Again, the considerations are serious and it can change the course of their career. So they have to be very careful about crossing boundaries, about revealing sources and information. But again, if you get to the core issue of what's the impact of this topic, what's the disease burden, what's the how much money was stolen, etc., and you don't write a story about so and so stole money, you go into a community and find a family that doesn't have access, or a child who's dying or whatever, and you tell that story. And that keeps you from getting involved in the ethical nuances and challenges of a topic. Does that help, Hira?
Yeah, thank you for your amazing response. That was great.
So one more question we have, last question. Can we have a small portion of fact where science storytelling, or we just have to use the message tune? Uh,
Oh, please do not get the impression that I'm saying don't ever use facts. If you look at the best stories, the most powerful, the most emotional, the most moving stories, each of them will contain the data. I mean, you can't uh, tell a sweeping story about a topic and only have it be filled with emotion and drama, etc. You have to put the numbers. You have to show how many people in the country are affected by this issue. As I said with my original example, what I did was calculate how much money was spent in helping people die in a hospital from cancer versus how much money is spent by allowing them to enroll in a hospice program that's paid for by the state. Um, how many numbers of people. So you must always be able to back up your stories and your storytelling with the data. You don't want to have it overwhelm it, and you don't want to perhaps start a story with 5,000 people in Pakistan have this rare disease, blah, blah, blah. That it has much less impact than finding a family with that rare disease, talking about how it impacts them, and then you introduce the numbers. You get me? Does that make sense?
Yes, I think. Uh, well, I think we are quite done with it. Thank you, Miss Rachel. This was truly amazing. The material and the stuff, the stories you brought up, these have really impacted us in a very positive way. And we will try to reconnect with you. We have your email. We will share everything with the participants and our team. And thank you for making a difference and taking. Thank you for your time.
Thank you all so much. And I mean it. Please do stay in touch. And if there's anything I can do to help, let me know.
Thank you.
All right. Take care.